Hey, good evening. Class is in session with the Invisible Night School. For anyone joining us, welcome. Whether you're live or watching this recorded, we are very glad that you're here. The Invisible Night Club, the Invisible Night Club, I wish. The Invisible Night School is a small consortium of lay researchers and scholars exploring UFOs, UAPs, high strangeness, and the cultural and social implications of the phenomenon. You can find us at theinvisiblenightschool.com. So I'm going to welcome on my co-hosts here, Nick, Lewis, and Campbell. It's been a few weeks. I'm a little bit rusty.
Yeah. StreamYard's pretty tricky.
I know StreamYard is really tricky. It's like,
so I've heard,
complicated. So tonight we're going to be talking with Campbell, who maintains UAPstudy.com. We'll be talking about plasma physics, UFOs, and the scientific method. Before we get into that, we're also going to be speaking with Nick about his pet case, the 1994 Lake Michigan sightings. And then I'll also be talking about my time at the New York City symposium a couple weeks ago with Gary Nolan, Mitch Horowitz, and a couple other members of the community. So, Nick, why don't you go ahead and tell us about Lake Michigan?
Sure. So the new season of Unsolved Mysteries just landed on Netflix, where they're releasing it in a series. And episode 2 was the case that I previously worked on and found out I was cut from a couple of weeks ago. But it's about the Lake Michigan case of 1994. And while I thought they stuck to the facts mostly, there was one interesting claim that I had never heard that came out, and it seems to be kind of the big one that's getting pushed around. I've seen Jeremy Corbell retweeted. I've seen Colavito posting about an article with a conversation in the director talking about UFOs looking for water. And as I was seeing this come out, I watched the episode the morning it came out, and I was kind of looking at the posts. And this new claim about a couple camping on the beach at midnight and seeing a UFO sucking up the water, I thought was really odd, because this is a new claim to the case. This hasn't been reported before, and at least the show heavily implies that this encounter came from Virginia Tilley, one of the original investigators. If you remember. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, just before you dive into like this particular thing, can you give us just like a couple minute overview of this case for people?
The whole case? Yes.
Yeah.
March 8th, 1994. Multiple ground witnesses see a group of lights come together, kind of spin around in a circle and depart. Now, a good number of them called 911, the Ottawa County Dispatch, and this conversation was recorded. So we're able to kind of pinpoint where this thing was related to the ground witness seeing it. The police end up showing up about 10 minutes later, confirms it, tries to follow it. Due to all of these 911 calls about this UFO flying over the neighborhood in Holland, Michigan, by the way, they call the National Weather Service, which is just about 30 miles north in Muskegon. And the radar operator there, the weather radar operator, Jack Bouchon, starts picking up anomalous returns on his radar throughout the whole night. And his conversation is also recorded on that tape. So we have a pretty well-witnessed case, as I like to say it, and borrowing from Michael Swords. What I like about the 911 call is that it's recording these eyewitness testimonies in real time, so they can kind of corroborate each other, and they aren't subject to exaggeration or misremembering over the years, which you do see from talking to these witnesses. This is a 30-year-old case. So this new episode kind of explores that, and Jack Bouchon, the weather radar operator, kind of exploring this case, trying to figure it out. So when I first came back into the UFO scene, this was the first case I started researching. I reached out to a lot of the witnesses, including Jack and Holly Graves, who was featured on the show. I was never able to get a hold of Virginia Tilley. But in dealing with them, they mentioned that they were also speaking with a producer from Unsolved Mysteries, and we ended up connecting. And a lot of that work that we did before filming, there was a lot of phone calls going on, kind of just information finding, research, stuff like that. A lot of them were recorded, and occasionally I would speak to Jack on the phone, and the producers would record that too. That's where, and I'm pretty sure I can say this, I don't think NDAs hold out now that the episode's out. One thing that Jack was mentioning to me was that a portion of Lake Michigan, the southern portion just next to Chicago, was the only part of the lake that was unfrozen. And on that call, I said, "Oh, well, I believe that the NOAA keeps ice records of or Lake Michigan, all the ice coverage." So we looked that up.
Mhm.
That was kind of part of the discovery of this. Now, moving to filming, what they really focused on was, as a researcher, what I was looking for in this case. I mean, it's a 30-year-old case. A lot of the stuff's already out there. And my main point was trying to match up what the people on the ground saw with the radar sightings, because we can't conclusively link these yet, because you don't have like a moment where that we know of that was on the ground and people see it and he saw it on the radar. So that was kind of like the goal, and it was like heavily stressed. Now, in my questioning, they kind of like, the director kind of played up like, "Oh, well, are there other, is this like kind of a hot spot for UFOs along Lake Michigan? Do you see them interacting with the water?" And I rattled off like Wynneque, back in the 60s. Even Hudson Valley had some water-related incidents. And I mentioned what Jack and I had seen too. Now, this was a couple of years ago that we were doing all this this research and the filming and stuff. A rumor started spreading around between the some of the witnesses who were in the actual episode about a new witness was found. Now, come like a year later, this episode finally releases, and we see it's at least heavily implied that Ginny Tilley finds a witness account from 1994 of people on the beach, like I said, camping. March, in the middle of the winter, the middle of the night, camping on the beach. I thought that was a little strange. And they see out over the water just a tower of water going up into a light. And I thought this was really strange, especially coming from one of the original investigators, because we haven't heard this claim before. So my take on it was that either it is a legitimate claim that was made back then and just hasn't been published. As we know, there are many things about this case that haven't been published that were held onto by Mufon. But unfortunately, we don't have anything to substantiate it. We don't know who these witnesses are. And, nothing's matching up with the phone call that we have, the one piece of evidence that we can kind of corroborate these stories. But it started when I saw it, and then I was rewatching it and talking to people on Twitter. It started like really ringing a bell to me. And in 1994 in Australia, Gosford Lake, there was a UFO sighting that was extremely similar to that. UFOs over a body of water sucking it up into there. Same year, I wonder if it was maybe a confabulation on Tilley's part from back then. I mean, she was an active UFO investigator in 1994. I wonder if some wires got crossed there. But I also kind of, I noticed that the narrative in the story at that point was about Jack trying to link the sightings, the on-the-ground sightings, with his radar sightings. And actually, he says in the episode, "This proves it. This is the link I was looking for." However, it kind of contradicts the timeline that even the show established, where the on-the-ground sightings were around 9:30 p.m., 9:30 to 9:45 p.m. That's around the beginning of when the dispatcher calls Jack at the Weather Service station. He tracks these things till midnight. Now, this claim of this waterspout UFO, these witnesses alleged that this happened at midnight, and they were like right off of Benton Harbor. So at the beginning of the portion with Jack speaking, you can hear him calling off where his radar is hitting. And he says a lot of it's down right by Benton Harbor and Decatur area and off Lake Michigan. But they don't move to that southern portion till around 11 or midnight when he says they disappear. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I see this this claim coming out of nowhere and getting kind of legs and being added to the myth of this case when we don't know where it came from. We don't know if it actually is related to this case. And it certainly doesn't confirm this kind of narrative that they were going to, that I feel a little responsible for kind of putting onto them too during the interview process. So I don't know. I see this claim taking legs, and I kind of wanted to nip it in the bud since I see it kind of popping off now. But that's my story about the Lake Michigan case in the Unsolved Mysteries episode.
Yeah, I mean, this witness testimony from people camping also seems pretty incongruent with like all the other testimony associated with this case.
Yeah.
Right. Like.
No, I mean, like, it's really a shame because right in the middle of that episode, you have Bill Konkoleski, who's the chair of Michigan Mufon, come in there and they talk about Mufon and how they investigated, and they take reports from, thousands of cases all across the country, blah, 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 blah. Mufon, by their own admission, has videos and photos from this case that they have never released. And specifically mentioned in one of their journals is a video from a woman in Marcellus, which is right next to Decatur. And she said she was filming this thing around that 9:30 time frame. So I think that would go a lot further in establishing the link between the on-the-ground witnesses with the radar sightings. But they're still sitting on it. And he had a perfect opportunity being in that show to present that evidence, but we never got to see it.
Do we have any reason why Mufon isn't releasing any of this? Or hasn't released any of it? Are there any good conspiracies, at least?
I don't know. The explanation I got from Bill Konkoleski when I called him was Mufon likes to present the information they collected on their own in their own terms. So they don't give it out to me, for example, when I was making a podcast, to share that. So I thought, okay, well, I knew Bill was involved in this episode. So I was like, well, maybe we'll see one of them there, because that is Mufon kind of presenting it. He was there. He was kind of repping Mufon. This would be a good opportunity for him to share at least some of it. I mean, he admitted that they don't look like much. Stephen Greenstreet reached out to try to get these videos and tapes too, and got the same response. Let me dig them up. They're not much, and then ghosted.
So, yeah, Slink McCloud. Yeah, they need more than 30 years to present. Yeah,
sure.
What are they waiting for?
Right? I'm not exactly sure. And that's the reaction I get every time I bring this up and show clips from their journal. They're like, wait a minute, I thought Mufon was on our side. What's Mufon doing? And we constantly tag them and stuff. I haven't gotten a good answer as to why they would just sit on it.
I kind of can't remember who in this our little coterie of UFO people. Is anyone a Mufon field investigator, or have you ever been one?
I was kind of base level. I ended up paying the monthly fees just to see if I could get more access to the information in their database.
Sure.
Which was bare bones, if to put it lightly. There's nothing there. Especially,
I should look into getting trained as a field investigator.
I mean, if you want to pay them to get the book and stuff, maybe you can dig a little deeper. But these things are inaccessible. I mean,
oh my God, dude, I will never get laid again if my two hobbies are UFO investigation and amateur radio. That's it.
Don't wear your lanyard.
I'm gonna be a spinster forever.
I just, yeah, it's a good question. Why haven't they shared it? I mean, even if it, to Bill's own admission, they look poor, but if there's any kind of landmark you can notice in that video, or even the time or direction, it could bring us at least a little closer.
Well, and there's been a lot of challenges to Mufon for many years now, right? Like there was that whole infamous thing where they were selling their data to Bigelow,
Mm-hmm.
and they've always been very protective of their information, right? And so if they're monetizing it while being protective and not sort of being forthcoming in the circumstances where it feels like it would be that time to do it, it really looks bad on them and does not help their reputation at all.
But meanwhile, they are kind of amongst UFO groups a household name. You know what I mean? They're the Walmart of UFO groups, essentially. Moms have heard of them sometimes. And I'll also point out that any type of UFO coverage on media, they have a representative in it too. So
they probably have media training so people can actually talk to reps. Man, I just remember listening to Peter Davenport. He's not Mufon. He was National UFO Reporting Center in the 90s on Coast to Coast AM. And he would pull the Linda Moulton Howe where he'd hold the tape recorder up to the landline phone and play it over AM radio. There's a very particular nostalgia to listening to those old conversations. But he always seemed to be kind of much more above board, but just doesn't have the same household recognition as Mufon does.
I want to say one other thing too, and I don't want it to come off as me disparaging anyone. But Tilly, Virginia Tilly, the original investigator who I believe that this waterspout UFO report came from, she was also the one who quit Mufon in protest to start her own group here in Grand Rapids. And she put out that newsletter called The Outer Connection. I think it was a year or so later. But the interesting thing, and this part wasn't written by her, so I don't want to say like this necessarily affects her track record. It was by a different reporter in her new group. But he gave this whole cloak and dagger, deep throat story about how he got these radar images from that case, which of course turned out to be the radar blanks that Professor Michael Swords and Jack Bouchon made several days after the fact. One copy stayed with Swords and went back to QFOS, J. Allen Hynek's QFOS, and the other one went to the NOAA. So perhaps they were FOIA'd or something, but the story of how these things came to be, it was from a secret insider who died apparently, and they were talking in like old message boards and AOL chat rooms.
Why can't this hobby have like one normal thing?
I don't know.
Why is it always like this?
This weird shady story is clearly...
It's always weird and shady. That is like it is de facto ufology if it is weird and shady.
But the thing about it is like it was unnecessarily so, because like these radar maps weren't a secret. They weren't classified or anything like that. They weren't even hidden. They just hadn't been published by QFOS at the time yet. So where did this story come from? So I want to point that out and say that's not exactly coming from Ginny Tilley. I'm not saying anything negative about her, but it does really make me wonder if that case was confabulated with the Gosford Lake 94 case, and it just kind of fit that story for the episode really well, because it tied in the weird water stuff. It alleged to kind of corroborate the on the ground and the radar sightings. Because people do have to remember with all media like this, whether it's Unsolved Mysteries or a James Fox documentary, this is entertainment. So it's not, don't do your research by watching TV shows or movies. Like actually look into it, listen to what the people say. I always recommend going to the AFU and looking up what people were reporting at the time.
I also wonder too, it feels like the like unidentified submersible objects has sort of entered the ufological zeitgeist a lot more. So it doesn't surprise me that they'd kind of try to fold that in to any sort of recollection on a historical case.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, they were telling a story. It's a TV show, obviously. So they were making connections. They were filling in gaps. I wouldn't take that seriously. I know. Sorry.
I haven't seen the actual episode yet, but the content that I've seen shared on like Twitter, it's interesting because it does seem to heavily involve the waterspout thing. And because we covered this with your excellent in-depth, analysis of the available information, like we are familiar with the verifiable details. And I find it very intriguing that potentially the most memorable element of this new representation is potentially entirely fictional. And it just is like such a classic example of everything wrong with this subject, right?
I mean, like I said in the beginning, it is possible that this was an original claim from back in 1994. We do know that multiple people called into 911 that aren't on that tape. And we know that Mufon took a lot of reports from around then. So sure, maybe it is an original account. I don't think it adds any value to the story, as dramatic as it sounds, because like I said, it's not corroborated on that tape. We're hearing this out of the blue 30 years later, and it doesn't line up with the recording of Jack tracking the radar. You know what I mean? None of them were off the coast of Benton Harbor at the time. According to him, they were all located. All the returns were located kind of southern area of Lake Michigan down by Indiana and Chicago. So I don't know. It shook me when I watched it. And
on the episode, they had the radar operator sort of say something like, this sort of connects these things. Is that what I heard you say?
Yes. Yeah. And and from experience, the way that they have you speak on these shows is they ask you a question and then they say, tell it back to me like you're telling me a statement. So if the question is, what do you think about this? You're supposed to say, what I think about this is blah, 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 blah. So, I mean, you're coached to say certain things and kind of like, because they are, like I said, like I keep saying, they're building a narrative and stuff. So I said some kooky things myself. So I'm kind of glad it didn't make it.
You let your fame go to your head, man. You're going to be a rock star.
Yeah. Honestly, I was in a different mindset back then too. I was a little more wooey believer-y at the time too. So I think I lucked out. And aside from that waterspout thing, I want to say that they did cover the events pretty well. But I do, if you pay strict attention to what is said on the 911 tape and the visuals that they use, you'll notice that they are a bit exaggerated, in my opinion.
Mhm.
Although I did talk to Holly right after. She messaged me and she said, "What did you think?" And I was like, "Oh, it's cool, but more importantly, what did you think? You saw it." And she said that she thought the representation was good. So either
Cool.
her memory has been exaggerated over these years, or they did do a good job. And when she said it looked like a string of Christmas lights up in the sky, that was maybe she was more at loss for words, because that's what I always pictured as smaller lights kind of further away that come together and break apart, not these like discs that they show, these glowing discs that like explode in the sky on the TV show. That was neat to see, but that waterfall thing, man, I just don't know.
You said the water fountain spout. There was another case in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yeah,
actually,
witness.
I remember reading about something like that in this magazine called The X Factor
Mm-hmm.
back in the 90s. It was like a paranormal kind of series that you would buy every week.
Yeah.
There was actually another claim like that. I think it was from an American serviceman. So this story might have been sort of doing the rounds back then, this trope.
I wonder if you could find out which case that was. That's really interesting. Yeah. I'd like to see it because, I mean, like, there was a similar claim in at the Wynecke Reservoir. I think that was 66 or 67, but I don't remember. Craig would know. But I believe it was also sucking up water. And then one of the earlier claims in Hudson Valley was that they saw the boomerang hovering over water and dropping down kind of a red probe and like, I don't know, stirring the water or something. I'm not really sure what it was doing, but lots of stories of them interacting with water.
Doesn't like the Council Bluffs, Iowa case involve this kind of stuff too?
Say that again?
I think it might. The Council Bluffs, Iowa case.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Like, yeah, that one. I remember that one coming up on UCR from Rather a few times and looking into it. There's not too much like extant resources or documentation on it, but it happened at like a park with a big lake, and I feel like it has something similar to that, where it was dropping slag and then pulling up water.
Oh,
based on witness reports.
Maury Island was like that too, where they were dropping the donut UFOs that were dropping the slag in the water, hit a dog allegedly, and put a hole in a boat.
A hot dog.
That was an old one. Kenneth Arnold was involved in.
Really? Oh, that's like an OG.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the von Neumann probes.
One of the things that Hynek investigated was like some UFO dropping hot fragments over these boatmen.
Yeah, I think that was Maury Island.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Or Shag Harbor was different. I don't know. They're all the same. They're all the same, and they're all drones.
It could be China.
Mm-hmm. I think it probably is China. All the way back.
Well, case closed. We can end the stream. We're good. Excellent. So, Nick, thanks for the recap. I do think we owe this case like a deep dive on the live stream. I know we did the Twitter space on it.
But,
yeah. You know, having the opportunity to go back and forth about it and talk through it, I think is interesting, especially again, because we're seeing this like community collaborative myth making emerge again about an old case now that it's sort of being brought back up for air on Unsolved Mysteries.
I just see it snowballing too. But like my examples are two people posting about it, but I can just see it picking up steam from there. I tried to jump into the comment section and kind of like put out little fires, at least from my perspective.
Good luck. It's pissing into the wind, man.
I know. I'll always talk about this case though. So if next stream you want to talk about it, I'll bring slides. I've got a lot of documents and info on the case, so we can go over it like in terrible, excruciating detail next time.
Oh, I can't wait. We're all gonna be like, we're all UFO Rain Men, so this is great. So I was gonna kind of do like my little show and tell piece. So I was in New York City about 10 days ago now for an inquiry into anomalous experiences and the phenomenon, which was this one-day symposium hosted by James Iandoli, who runs the Engaging the Phenomenon podcast, and then J. Christopher King, who runs the Experiencer Group. They were joined by two awesome co-hosts, Kelly Chase and Priscilla Stone, who run UFO Rabbit Hole and Quantum Witch Cafe. And I went to the symposium. Actually, Nathan from Calling All Beings was kind enough to give me a ticket. Really appreciates what we're doing with our own podcast, I think, and the kind of conversations we're having. And, it's basically in my backyard. So I jumped a train, went down to the city, and the lineup was pretty solid. I was saying in the green room before we started, as an ex-academic, I could say pretty candidly that the majority of the speakers would not have been out of place at like a standard academic conference. The lineup was like pretty stacked. We had Dr. Sean Esbjorn Hagens, who had the first presentation of the day, talked a lot about the connection between experiencer phenomena and sort of these constellation of numinous events that humans have been reporting throughout history. And he walked us through basically like the different frameworks that different religions and spiritual systems use to like frame and identify and understand different things. And like I've been on a deep rabbit hole with mystical Buddhism lately, so it was really cool seeing like a discussion about Vajrayana and the rainbow body alongside conversations about like contemporary experiencer phenomenology.
Yeah, that sounds right up your alley.
Yeah, it was super cool. And kudos to him, because he also is doing something that I think is important, which is he's almost in an ethnographic fashion approaching experiencer phenomena. So rather than, he's basically trying to disintermediate like UFO, government, black ops, conspiracy narratives from the experiencer experience, which I think is really cool and important. Like he's treating it like with a sense of academic rigor, and pretty interdisciplinary. He was also anyway, my point is I found the content and quality of his presentation like pretty impressive. Tim Grieve Carlson from Westminster College in Pennsylvania, he read an excerpt from his book on the Big Thicket in East Texas. He was a PhD student under Jeff Kripal at Rice University, basically writing about the role of, I think, like occult phenomena and folk religion and stuff. Very interesting. Again, super academic. I don't want to project anything onto the crowd, but like I'm at the edge of my seat completely nerding out, but I'm pretty sure a lot of the people in the audience were like, show me the fucking aliens. Like, what's going on here? We had Mitch Horowitz. Yeah, they've been waiting a long time. And, it's always, they were hoping soon was that Saturday. Mitch Horowitz spoke candidly. He was really who I went to see. I mean, I really love Mitch Horowitz, cult scholar and historian. Definitely kind of the black sheep on the lineup, but he really spoke about the necessity of skepticism in these spaces and the need for collaboration between like researchers and skeptics to really help deliver high integrity research and analysis. So like, again, subject of my own heart, like I was like, great, this is exactly what needs to be said about these things.
Was this recorded? I know.
Yeah, it's recorded.
Okay.
Yeah, it's recorded. I haven't gotten a copy of the recording. I'll see if I can dig up a copy for you guys. I think you would appreciate it. In all seriousness, cool. I thought it was very, very good. Exo-Academian presented, this guy Darren. I am not familiar with him. He talked a lot about like consciousness and reality. He cited my favorite, talked a lot about Bernard R. Kastrup, Penrose, Rupert Sheldrake, sort of like the best of hits on this kind of stuff. Sure. And then, of course, the headliner was Gary Nolan. And Gary Nolan, like, man, dude has it made. He talked for like 2 minutes and then just took questions from the audience for probably an hour and a half.
That sounds all right.
Like, very candidly, like, that's the side of ufology, like, that I pay the least attention to. Like, the Gary Nolan, Elizondo government, whatever crowd. Like, I know the least about it. I kind of am the least invested in it in some ways. But he, I will say to Gary's credit, his disposition in person speaking is very different than it is on the internet.
That's
probably
good.
Unsurprisingly, yes. And he was asked, this plethora of questions that were pretty detailed and arcane, like that belied like a real familiarity with not only like his ufological research, but his actual like Stanford Institute research. Overall, like they're holding another one on December 3rd with Leslie Kean, Whitley Strieber, Jeff Kripal. Jeff Kripal for me alone is the reason to make another trip to New York. I adore Jeff Kripal. So I plan on being in attendance. So in some great event. But what I really wanted to talk about, which I think is especially interesting, was sort of the post-event experience, right? So first and foremost, like, got to meet a lot of people in the community, especially people on like the other side of the community that, you know, I don't have as much interfacing with.
The milk carts.
Oh, yes, yeah. King Milkfart was there.
Mhm.
Tiny Klaus was there. It was sort of like the best of the greatest hits of UFO Twitter. Everybody was super pleasant, friendly. Lots of people recognized me, which was really kind of cool and also a little terrifying. Like when people recognize you and like and I'm just like, dude, I just know you as a UFO picture on Twitter and like a jumble of names and numbers. Like, I don't know who you are. But people were really cool. And I think it's also like a classic example of what happens when you make good faith effort to coalition build or even just show up in each other's spaces. Cause like nobody starts shit. You realize you're, you know, actually human beings. You have a shared interest. People were well behaved and welcoming. But the other thing that was really interesting for me was watching kind of the post-event responses to a lot of the things that were discussed in these presentations. And I say this because, and I say this candidly, without claiming to be free of cognitive biases or my own projections, but a lot of the post-event discourse that I saw emerge on Twitter and in like sort of the UFO space felt to me very much a transmutation of what was actually discussed that day in many of those presentations. Like I even by very strong ultra skeptic critical materialist thinking, I think everybody I know in that arena could have sat through these presentations and found them pretty meritorious and like worthy of consideration. Aliens and extraterrestrials didn't come up like once that entire day. But I can't tell you how many times I read some discourse about what people saw or heard, and it involved aliens, extraterrestrials, abductees, this kind of like remanufacturing again of like community myth based on what like people seeing what they wanted to see or hear out of these presentations. And you know, I mean, we always talk about the kind of community and collaborative myth making that happens in ufology. It was kind of interesting to see happen basically in real time, where I was like, did we even attend like the same conference? Like, did we hear the same talks here? Like, how could you take away, like, even Dr. Nolan was pretty reserved in his discussion about disclosure, and the idea that people were coming away being like, oh man, disclosure is coming soon, we're gonna know everything. I was like, what happened here? Did we listen to the same person?
Right. I always ask, like, especially after doing the Hudson Valley case, like, how did people see a formation of planes as this dramatic event? People see through their biases, you know what I mean? Like, everyone's seeing it through filters. People are having different experiences, even in this conference. It's wild.
Yeah. Well, I mean, think about with Hudson Valley, where people experience like legitimate spiritual experiences, right? They had these like consciousness shifting experiences because what they were witnessing at the time to them was unidentifiable and sort of broke apart their ontology.
The different lenses people can view the same thing through. It's really strange to me, but really interesting. I can't wait to actually like see this whole conference.
Yeah, it's absolutely worth watching. Like in my opinion, completely worth watching. Not a waste of time.
Cool.
You know, differences in the community aside, like it was a very well orchestrated event. It ran on time. It started on time, finished on time. People were well behaved. The other thing that I'll say, and give credit to the organizers for, is it was a deliberately intimate conference. It was like 75 people in that auditorium. Science Bob was there. Linda Thompson. It was Leslie Keene, Anjali. Like I said, it was like
interesting.
It was very interesting. And people, you know, like it's like I keep saying, and I mean, I hope everyone here knows I'm no shrinking violet when it comes to strong opinions. If I thought it sucked or people were assholes, I'd be like, this shit sucked, don't bother. But I thought it was really great. Like, I'm going to the December one and looking forward to like meeting more folks sort of in that space of the community.
You've convinced me to check it out.
Yeah. Like, I mean, and if nothing else, like I always come back to kind of, and maybe this is being more generous than is warranted. I have more naivete than I think a lot of people do in this community still. But even if stories are relayed that are false or wrong or seem to be too much of a stretch of the imagination or whatever, like there's still something fascinating and about witnessing the emergence of myth, right? Like I think about like Bob Lazar is a good example. Like to a certain degree, it doesn't even matter if Bob Lazar is telling a true story because he's woven himself so effectively into ufology that his presence in this sort of community myth in and of itself like brings attention on it or brings attention on himself, like just by virtue of having so substantially created and disseminated his own story. So like that's that. And this sort of like chaser on all this is I came back super gung-ho about this idea of working, or sort of not even working, but like thinking about the necessity of doing ethnography with experiencers, like ethnographic interviews and research. Basically, you need somebody who's going to be Alfred Kinsey for experiencers. You know, you need somebody who's going to basically conduct a ton of interviews and think about them thematically. And I got pointed in the direction of this guy, Ray Hernandez, who I've subsequently like connected with. He's kind of an old guard consciousness, NDE, OBE, astral projection kind of guy. Tends to see a lot of experiencer phenomena through the lens of like kind of the classic spiritual emergence, Kundalini awakening, etc. So I've connected with him. He's trying to bring out some new research from CCRI, which has been like this think tank of pretty well established academics, cross-disciplinary, and experiencers kind of writing up pretty, I would characterize as fairly rigorous, not only personal accounts, but like research into the nature of consciousness and reality. So that sort of was the cool little chaser on this little experience, was winding up connected with CCRI and Ray over the last week. Yeah, it's been super cool.
What's everybody else been up to?
Just in life?
Yeah, come on.
Yeah, anything, man. It's been a while.
Second, yeah.
What are you up to?
Oh God, it's so hard to step out of the UFO mentality and step into real life. But I've just been doing work and stuff. But let's not talk about real life. That's why we're here, is to ignore real life.
Yeah, escapism.
That's why we talk about UFOs, right?
Yes.
But I thought that what you were saying, Leah, about the way that myth gets constructed in real time is really interesting, because it's like with the Lake Michigan thing we were just talking about, that this interesting thing happens where the people who end up being sort of the mythical figures that lead the public interest end up bringing in all of these things that are not necessarily true into the story because they're memorable. And then when somebody comes into it and starts observing it, even if there's a kernel of truth at the heart of it, i.e. like Bob Lazar was working as a contractor at Area 51 before it was publicly known. That's pretty interesting. And then he is spreading his own lies and stuff or whatever. I don't want to insult anybody, but he says things that aren't verified. And then it
You're going to give Lewis a stroke.
I know. And then it invalidates the entire perspective on the whole thing, though, right? And so it's all thrown away or it's all good. And like that's something that I see as potentially emerging from the Lake Michigan thing too, with like the radar operator. Like even if he was 100% reliable historically, if they cut and pasted his one comment out of place, now it's part of the myth, and now he's unreliable, and now we throw out all the radar. It's like, and that's just what happened. Even though it's legit originally in certain ways, it can invalidate the rest of it.
That was why I wanted to get on here quick and kind of nip this in the bud, or at least throw my perspective out there, at least so someone might hear it and consider it, because there is a good case underneath this stuff. But when you pile this other kind of stuff on and make it more fantastic, I hope the real good information doesn't just get swept away, you know.
Bob Lazar is my daddy too. Yeah, I've been thinking, so there's this theory that started emerging in like 2016, 2017 in a lot of these like information science circles about the liar's dividend, which is this idea that false news benefits from a boost in legitimacy when there's lots of conversation about how fake media exists. And like you see this, it also happens the other way, which is I think Joe Rogan's a perfect example of leveraging the liar's dividend in a very advantageous way for his sort of media empire, which is he stacks his guest list with generally legitimate people, but then maybe 20% of them aren't. But the presence of the majority of legitimacy confers legitimacy on the rest of his guests.
That makes absolute sense.
Yeah. And we see it in ufology all the time, right?
Yeah.
Like we see this notion that like proximity to a reliable source or reliable bit of information seems to imbue questionable information or individuals with a sense of legitimacy just by like proximity.
Right. That's what, like, that's also kind of why I wanted to stress that like TV shows like Unsolved Mysteries are for entertainment, and they are telling a story on top of what's already happening there. And I think a lot of people do think, like, I remember people talking about the TMZ special when it came out a couple of years ago, talking about like being good information. Like people were researching by watching these UFO specials and these UFO TV shows. And I don't think that that's the way to do it.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Well, and that's it's probably a good spot to start pivoting.
It's a good segue.
The discussion on the scientific method, philosophy of science, observation versus interpretation, all that good stuff.
Drop it.
Yeah. Campbell, you're the man of the hour.
Okay. Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's what got me kind of interested in this whole subject of UAP originally was it was from sort of 0 to 100. I grew up without any religion. I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't believe in UFOs, sea monsters, anything. Like I had zero understanding of the paranormal. All of that, none of that was a part of my worldview. Just completely absent. Not even like looking down on it or anything. Just zero engagement whatsoever. And then during the virus, when everything got locked down, things seemed all crazy. And then President Obama came out on the Late Late Show with James Corden in May 2021, and he gave a very strange interview that caught my attention for the first time because I had followed Obama through my entire university. Like he was like my president growing up. I'm Canadian, but like he was the president, you know. And it was just so strange to have him come out in the middle of a virus with all this UFO stuff in the like in New York Times, all this stuff. And then he's saying, well, no, there are objects up there that we don't really know what they are. And he doesn't even stop there. He says, we can't explain how they move. Their trajectories. They did not have an easily explainable pattern. So people still take seriously, try to figure out what those things are. And that just struck me so weird because I would expect him to say the first part. Oh yeah, there are UFOs out there. And what I couldn't figure out was why would Obama draw people's attention to this subject when I knew academically it was associated with like, you know, white supremacy, terror. The FBI has it on the same slides as like terrorism and stuff as a threat to national security.
Incredible.
So it's like, why is Obama sort of putting kindling in this at all? It made absolutely no sense. And as well as that, it was the obvious thing that it's like, I felt very confident. I wouldn't say certain, but I felt very confident that the United States has the capacity to identify objects in Earth's atmosphere for the most part. And so my assumption was like, if there are like all these alien spaceships or whatever coming in here, like they would be getting observed probably. And so why would Obama be saying he doesn't know what they are? Why would he be drawing attention to that if the US can't identify something? Makes no sense.
Right.
So that was sort of the baseline. It was like, this makes absolutely no sense according to my worldview. So it was like, it broke into my attention for the first time that way. And so that was sort of the heart of it. And then I started doing research, and that was what turned into my website, uapstudy.com. Yeah. And I guess I could just start getting into it. Have you guys had any, I'd be curious actually. What do you guys, have you had a moment of sort of being pulled into something brand new that you didn't have any exposure to historically? What about you, Leah?
You know, I would say UFOs, but like that's what I've only been pulled into is like the post 2017 discourse is totally new to me because my experience with UFOs was like 1990s, like X-Files, Art Bell stuff, not Tic Tacs and obviously the government's always factored into these ideas, but it seems the post-2017 landscape of the subject is predominantly sort of government and military driven.
That's true. I've explained this a couple times, but I had stepped away from all paranormal subjects like 5-6 years ago, and I was in between jobs at the time when that 2017 thing came out, and that kind of got me reinterested too.
What is it with UFOs and being an unemployed degenerate? Like, that's what got me into it. Like, I didn't have a job, and I was like, oh, I think I'm gonna get into Twitter and into UFOs.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
the two big brain hobbies.
Of course, like I had been interested in UFOs as a kid growing up, like you mentioned too, like X-Files,
Sure.
Unsolved Mysteries, sightings, all that kind of stuff in the 80s and 90s. But that did bring me back in. I mean, that headline was pretty attention grabbing.
And it was in the Times, right?
Yeah.
It's the
the
fucking
Glorious
paper of
News, yeah.
record.
It seemed pretty significant at the time, before we got into a lot of the details of it, obviously. But yeah, I mean that was kind of I think that's a lot of people's entry point now, or at least a lot of the current people that we interact with on a daily basis, like part of the new community is we're all kind of introduced with this. It definitely made a splash.
Yeah, what about you, Luis?
Probably researching like Blavatsky and that sort of jazz.
Nice.
What triggered that? Was there a specific incident?
Are you a theosophist, Lewis? You can tell us. It's just us.
Not at all. Not at all. I guess like a few years ago, I'd read Leslie Kean's book, and then I read a few of Jacques Vallée's books. But then it was probably Jacques Vallée kind of got me into thinking about the psychological aspects of the whole thing. But yeah, I guess it was Jacques Vallée, even though I don't really credit his take ultimately. I think he does raise some points, good points.
Yes. And yeah, and that was interesting to me too, because the New York Times article had like come over across my radar, but it didn't like grab my attention. I kind of just like was like, oh, whatever. I remember in 2018 in the spring with my brother, I pulled up the video that's the famous, like the gimbal or whatever. And I was like, this thing looks weird, eh? And we were just sitting there being like, this is a weird looking thing. And like the pilot's emotion made it interesting, but I forgot about it and just like didn't look at it ever again because it was like, okay, whatever. Wait to see what happens, see what they find out.
Right.
Yeah, so Campbell, I've read UAPstudy.com. I think it's an awesome, very impeccably well researched, well presented documentation basically around post 2017 ufology, sort of what brought us to this space, the research that's been done on it, particularly through, as you've mentioned, this lens of basically like plasma research in physics. And it's with knowing the structure of this initiative that you've crafted, I am curious to know what your views are on like the psychosocial phenomena or like the Vallée or mythology side of things, because like that to me is the really kind of like amorphous side of the community. I don't think we see too many government reports on it, and I'm super curious what your views are on that.
Well, that's I start touching on that aspect of it in the final chapter of the website, chapter 10. So it might be jumping the gun a bit to start with that, but I find that an interesting element. So I'll just very briefly touch on sort of the essence of what you're describing. And Jason Colavito actually did this very effectively on Mick West's podcast when he was on there talking with him. Basically, there was a merger in the 20th century of a variety of folklore traditions of seeing luminous objects behaving in unusual ways. And essentially this emergence of the UFO as, concurrent with the end of World War II, all of that stuff. And an Vallée did such an effective job after the fact, starting in the 60s and moving forward, of retrospectively observing the described features from the subjective perspective of the experiencers, and then going through history, especially Western folklore, and seeing extremely close parallels, which is a very to elves and ghosts and fairies and all this stuff. Very similar descriptions, and it's similar to what you were actually describing about that individual at that conference, I suppose. These subjective similarities. Yeah, so that's a very interesting element, and it's the observation versus interpretation that drives all of this, you know, because it's like, okay, starting with Obama, former President Obama, he's saying like, we're observing these things and they're behaving in ways that are hard to explain. He could be talking about balloons. He could be talking about whatever. It's not like, oh, this is definitely something new and wild and it could be aliens. He never said anything like that. But it's strange that he even introduced, maybe you should look at this even. So after Obama said that, I read the New York Times article meaningfully for the first time. I got an essence of what was being described. I became familiar with the idea of like the Nimitz Tic Tac, and that was very strange to me. I couldn't understand what I was reading really, because I was like, this isn't like a alien spaceship from anything that I've sort of picked up on historically, right? So I was confused by what was being described, and then I started doing just like some generic searches on like research databases for UAP related publications in physics journals, natural science journals, earth sciences journals. And that's when these very interesting published physics papers were coming up. And then the most important one, the first one that I found that was the most significant, was the one that I lead the website with in following the introduction, which was to investigate or not to investigate is the intro of the title. It was published in, I believe, 2016 in I can't remember, the Journal of Frontiers in Earth Science by Karan and Faridi, and it describes a series of field study observations in a variety of places around the world, and it talks about luminous objects in the Earth's atmosphere behaving in ways that are inconsistent with previously recognized objects. It's near instantaneous accelerations to 8,000 meters per second, variety of colors, all of the features.
Do the talking point thing about UAPs.
Wait, which thing?
Where you describe them all the characteristics.
Oh, yes,
rapid fire.
That's the introduction of the UK Ministry of Defense report.
Right.
Yes.
Oh God. Yeah. I haven't said it in like a month or two now. I'm like,
I know we're all rusty. I fucked up the intro. You're fucking up the UAP comments.
Yeah. Let me capable of hovering, landing, accelerating to exceptional velocities and vanishing. They can outmaneuver any known vehicle, manned or unmanned. It's like,
yes, it's perfect.
But that's from the UK Ministry of Defense. But so this paper published in 2016, it came up when I was just looking up UAP in a research database. It's a peer-reviewed physics paper, and it lists all of the features of what you'd think would be like, a UFO, and then it says there has been spectrographic evidence that has verified conclusively in a paper in Physical Review Letters in 2014 of a confirmed observation of a ball lightning, which was the nucleus was 4 feet across and the luminosity was 16 feet across. It has been verified that ball lightning can be that large and do exist in Earth's atmosphere. And when I read that, and I read this review paper showing all of the different field study, information describing these objects, I didn't understand what I was reading, because nobody in the New York Times said anything about ball lightning existing. If it has been verified conclusively that luminous objects with this variety of features exist in Earth's atmosphere, it should be part of the main conversation, shouldn't it? And yet it is not. And that's interesting to me. So I started looking into it in more depth because of that.
Right. I mean, this isn't a new connection either. I mean, people have been saying this since the 50s, right?
At least the 50s, yes. Arthur C. Clarke wrote a series of papers in the 50s describing that he's quite convinced that based on the described features, which were the same exact features, including what he said as near instantaneous silent accelerations. led him to conclude that these were likely to be plasmoids, i.e. ball lightning. And they're silent in their near instantaneous acceleration because they are a ball of just pure energy. And basically the energy cuts through the atmosphere. The air doesn't have to go around it. So there are no sonic booms. And they use plasma on aircraft, stealth aircraft now, or at least are developing the systems to produce that exact same effect, eliminating any sonic boom while traveling.
That's pretty cool.
Well, these characteristics that you're describing sound like a lot of classical cases. In fact, they sound a lot like what was described in the Lake Michigan case that we were talking about before.
Yeah, and there are and this gets interesting because there are published field studies, for example, from Hesdalen, Norway in 2004, published in the Journal of what's
Scientific Exploration.
Thank you. Yes, it's not an excellent
this is why we keep
publication. And it's dedicated to like frontier science, but they also include things that are like paranormal and stuff. It doesn't have a great reputation, so you can't lean on this paper hard. But it's
not
evident.
Nature, in other words.
It's not Physical Review Letters from 2014, which confirmed.
It's not Fate magazine either.
Yes,
on a spectrum of reliability here, it's
not
like
Fate, it's not Nature. Yes, but there's
it's a third ineffable thing.
Yes, exactly, and that's isn't that appropriate for the reality of UFOs, right?
Yeah, it's
right on the frontiers. Yes, and so there are a variety of field studies. There was a bunch of reports in Hesdalen. The legitimate physical scientists from Italy went there, from actually the Medicina radio telescope, SETI researchers. They brought a bunch of equipment up there. VLF receivers, very low frequency radio receivers, all kinds of radio equipment to sort of pick it up because they're familiar with radio, like energy transmissions.
Right.
They got a bunch of interesting observations that are consistent with the sort of descriptions that we would expect. They didn't get high enough resolution, spectrographic evidence, or radar returns or anything to say like this is proven.
Sure.
So it's just a big pile of evidence that doesn't conclude anything until we have 2014, which is proof that the objects can be that big. But it was a brief observation, and that object did not demonstrate the most maybe interesting elements. We didn't see it instantaneously accelerate. We didn't see it do all these other things. So we know that there are luminous objects 4 feet to 16 feet in diameter, plus the science shows that these things can be as big as the energy allows for. We know that those things exist in the atmosphere. So my reasoning was, it seems like this should be, for the most extraordinary instances for which everything else is discounted and people are saying, therefore, aliens, it feels like this should probably be in the middle there before aliens. And the fact that it is not is just, at this point, anthropologically fascinating to me.
Sure.
It's probably actually what's driving most of my interest in the subject at this point, because I don't know, once you go through like 200 physics papers on the subject of plasma and ball lightning, you're seeing so much information that indicates that all of the things that people have talked about in such detail for so long have plausible, sufficient, and in many cases verified through laboratory experiment characteristics that are perfectly consistent with the historic eyewitness reports of the most extraordinary UFO cases. And so it's like pretty neat, I think, because of that.
I'm continually like Campbell, one of my favorite things you've talked about is the interaction with the skeptic community about ball lightning. And I think it's always worth calling out a second time that 2014 was when ball lightning was scientifically proven to exist, right? Until then, like there was no, it was thought to exist and believed to exist, but there was no actual evidence of it, which is pretty mind-blowing, right? It's really cool.
It was contentious about ball lightning. I think there are a lot of skeptics who said that there wasn't enough evidence to say that, like, yeah, this is an established thing. So people kind of chalked it up with other woo almost.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, and Campbell, you have didn't you have an experience like that on like the Reddit skeptic community talking about ball lightning?
Yes, I've had a few experiences like that with skeptics, and the underlying philosophy is 100% correct, in my opinion. What the skeptics will approach the subject of ball lightning with, and it's actually summarized very effectively in a part of the website. So I'll just briefly say, like in 2006, in Skeptic magazine, a author wrote a whole piece arguing in favor of ball lightning. And they were arguing that there have been so many thousands of observations, hundreds of high credibility people, like all these photos and all this stuff. And it's like, therefore, like it's more likely than not that these things do exist. And then a response was published which says it's not sufficient evidence. We can't take people's word for it. It's like, so yeah. Anyway, you could go through any example. It's like the number of people saying they've seen it, and the questionable photos don't prove a phenomenon.
Sure.
And like that is correct. And so then it was from then until 2014 that was sort of like, okay, we're gonna like say yeah.
What about the kind of transmutation of encounters with non-human intelligence into plasma? And I bring this up because one of the things I was asked in a Twitter space once by Jess, our Jess, the Jess,
Go Kick Rocks,
Twitter Jess, Go Kick Rocks, was whether or not I thought plasma behaved or belied some kind of intelligence or consciousness.
Right.
That's strange.
Yes.
Yes, I remember I can see myself, I was soaking in the hot bath, like, taking it all in, enjoying my like evening role play as a swamp witch, thinking, what the fuck am I gonna say to this person? I don't know. Like, I just got done talking about sex rituals. Like, I don't have anything to say about whether plasma is sentient. Like, I have no idea.
I think we've talked about this on a space quite a while ago, but like as an observer of a phenomenon like that, how are we distinguishing intelligence from randomness? Are we projecting?
Like, how much are we projecting our own heuristics of what indicates consciousness or intelligence?
Right.
And also,
yes.
I mean, like Conway's Game of Life, like demonstrates that self-organizing behavior, which looks to us like intelligent behavior, is algorithmic. Like it's algorithmic at like very tiny scales. Like if you have like just a 9x9 grid and you play it by like Conway's algorithms, it will self-organize and behave in ways that are very much reminiscent of how living organisms behave.
Yes.
But anyway, Campbell, so is the plasma conscious?
That has not been verified based on anything I am aware of. It's a pretty interesting thing though. Okay, so it's like, how does it emerge that would even be a question that's asked of you?
Right.
Like, why is somebody asking you if you think plasma is conscious? Now, and let me point out, like before May 2021, I had never even thought about plasma. If somebody asked me what plasma was, I would have said an element of blood or something.
Yeah.
So it wasn't
it's
on
the
my
fourth
radar.
State of matter.
Yes, exactly. It's like pure energy. Well, not pure energy, but energy being guided by magnetohydrodynamics, exactly what you're describing, just sort of like thermodynamics, the basic physics, and it self-organizes in a variety of ways that appear to us to exhibit some kind of conscious intent. And it's interesting to think that, like, looking up at the stars 15,000 years ago or whatever, us attributing conscious intent to the predictable rhythmic nature of those natural phenomena, we created all the ideas, and the gods literally were those objects that were moving in a predictable way. The planets, like Jupiter, Deus Pater, the father god, right? Like that's what it was. So we have this natural inclination to project intent, intelligence onto natural phenomena. It's what keeps us alive. If you project the natural, like a tiger being in the bush when it shakes, like it's better to do that than to not and then get eaten, right? So it's selected for to project that type of thing. Plasma gets really interesting when it starts interacting with itself in an high energy environment. You can do this in labs. You can form like it naturally forms balls. It's like energy conservation. It's like drops of water, right?
Yeah, like
Surface,
optimizes towards like the most efficient organization or something.
yes, and
Or behavior. Yeah.
and you can create tiny, what's described as tiny ball lightnings in the lab. They're called skirmions, and they basically are 3-dimensional whirlpools. They are self-contained electromagnetic energy loops that are connected all together, and then they move in space, self-contained, and like in the ocean, a whirlpool, some can grow huge, and then they can travel across the entire like massive distances and transport entire animal communities massive distances. And
that's what happened to Atlantis.
Right, exactly. And that's where we're going with this.
I knew it.
And that's the final chapter. Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah, so with plasma, it operates according to magnetohydrodynamics. It's like fluid dynamics, and it's based on magnetism and electricity. And
Bernoulli's principle.
yeah, and so static electricity. And so basically something, this is actually touching on a very important part of this, which is exactly the projection of the conscious intent and the way that people can be most effectively reasoned with from an evidence-based perspective. If you are arguing with somebody who disagrees with you from an intrinsic, values-based, personality-based perspective, information has nothing to do with convincing them. That's just science.
Know what it does? If you directly insult their intelligence, I've found that super effective.
That will open them up.
Yeah.
They will roll back. They will say that you're a genius. Yeah. No. But yeah. So when you study, like, okay, how do you convince somebody of something? You have to get into, you ignore the information and you target philosophy, worldview. So it's like with somebody who's saying like, well, I saw this luminous object, it's an alien. So you have to think like, it's not about like, oh, let's reason with you that it's improbable that it's an alien. That's not helpful from a scientific perspective when you're trying to convince a person. You have to get into the philosophy. And the philosophy of projecting like the alien nature onto these objects is the perception of intelligent control.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't deal with that, then it's all a non-starter. That's what everybody instantly will come back to me with as the first thing every time. Well, it was clearly alive. It was clearly intelligent. And the reason that these plasmoids look intelligent is because they operate according to the principles of static electricity and magnetohydrodynamics. And there are a significant number of lab experiments that we can look at the videos of that show things as simple as flakes of carbon being charged and moving in an energized environment in a massive microwave, and they behave in the exact same ways as and this sounds absurd, but the Nimitz Tic Tac is described as behaving. Mm-hmm. There are hundreds of these flakes of the charged carbon. Some of them go all the way up, drop down to sea level, like are doing this. Some of them are doing these weird little jerky motions. Some of them are just mowing right in. Some of them are doing this weird like leaf-like falling effect that's often described. And then based on the energy in the microwave, they start spinning around in the center, dependent on the energy flow and all of that. And so you can use video experiments to show all of the behaviors that anybody who I've ever talked to on this subject coming back at me and saying like, this is the reason why we have to say they're intelligent is because of this set of behaviors. Mm-hmm. And then I can show like a dozen videos showing the exact behavior sets, except purely operating within the confines of a microwave with, charged particles and stuff. And then it depends on, how much the person's open to the actual information or not.
I wonder when you approach people with this concept, if they're holding it up to kind of compare to the UFO mythos and narrative as a whole instead of individual cases. Because the UFO mythos as a whole, I think a lot of people tie their personalities into. You know what I mean? Yes. It's part of them. It's part of who they are. They're part of this UFO community. That's part of this greater UFO narrative and stuff like that. So when someone like Mick West debunks some video as a seagull or a fly or a drone, they're like, he's attacking UFOs. He's saying all UFOs are drones or seagulls or something. I mean, you see even Dr. Gary Nolan poking fun at McWest, saying things are seagulls. But it's interesting. I think if people had a different perspective on the UFO topic in general and saw it as a wide collection of individual cases of unknown things, I think people would be a lot more accepting of options like this, or like ideas like you're presenting. You know what I mean? Because like what you're describing, like I said earlier, describes the Lake Michigan case really well. It describes the 1952 Washington invasion one really well too. These balls of like luminous objects, different colors, moving in strange patterns, being detected on radar, I think is another characteristic that can happen with these things.
Yeah,
I think if you present it on a case by case basis, which is I think how UFOs should be viewed. I mean, there's no like commonality between a lot of these cases, but we all classify them as UFOs. Like a Tic Tac and what was described at the Lake Michigan case, you wouldn't categorize as the same thing, I would think, unless we have this umbrella term kind of as UFOs. I wonder about that, because I mean, you've gotten pushback from even skeptics with this stuff, right? I mean, it's really strange. I don't know if it's all just kind of personal bias and personality being tied up into it or not.
No, yeah, and I think that you're raising a good point. I think that there is a big issue with communication around what we're even talking about when we're saying UFO.
Sure.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
I think that
Yeah,
there's a
no
lot
shit.
of there's a lot of dancing on both sides about like the exact definitional criteria there.
Mhm.
I mean, culturally, I side with skeptics 100% historically. I don't like debunking. I respect it and I approve of it, but I've never personally been involved with that. I find it kind of like I'm kind of somebody who acts based on being inspired by like finding new things actively, not like kind of like canceling other stuff, even though I think it's incredibly important.
Sure.
But yes, the underlying sort of like, I've wondered about this cultural phenomenon where actually, let me use a brief example. I was arguing with somebody about this exact thing, ball lightning, and whether like some of these most prominent cases might end up being resolved as ball lightning. And this skeptic individual was sort of saying like, expressing doubts or whatever. That's reasonable, because it's like it's probably just a variety of like mundane phenomena. This is sort of like something that, like, if ball lightning is proven to show these features that we're talking about, it would be new to science if we can prove that it can do these things, as opposed to just a variety of published papers of field study observations of it, plus the proof of ball lightning in itself existing. So I was saying to that person, I was like, well, if we look back on the sort of like culture war between the truth seekers / believers and skeptics, and we sort of are like, if the objects with the features as described historically do exist and they turn out to be ball lightning, like, who's more wrong historically, the skeptics or the believers? And the skeptic person said to me, they're both wrong equally. I think that's interesting, because I disagree with that, because I think it's obvious that the, in quotes, truth seekers were more correct, because they at least were saying descriptively the objects with these features did exist.
Sure. Yeah.
That said, they're also profoundly fundamentally wrong, and maybe in a deeper sense, because they're saying that it's like a non-human intelligence, as opposed to the skeptics always saying if this is something, it's likely something natural, even though it would be to discount the likelihood of it being something new with those features. Because I mean, I never even thought for a moment myself historically that would be something that would be in reality something with those features.
Right.
But that's been a sort of clash that I've seen. Absolutely.
I wanted to go back to something Nick said about the propensity in this community for people to personalize like skeptical approaches. And I bring this up because as I've become much more personally interested and invested in, I would say, the experiencer phenomenology, like reports that people make about their personal experiences.
Yeah.
I've also become very preoccupied with this process of unyoking experiencer phenomena from UFOs as observed phenomena. And I bring this up because I have a handful of people I talk to who share their experiences with me, who talk to me about this part of their lives. And one of the things I always am so curious about is like, how did they put two and two together? Like, what made them connect what they have experienced with ufology? Because like, and I say that because not that I'm like the arbiter of intellectual strength or prowess or whatever, but like I'm pretty
Wow.
well educated and well read in like the history of religion and spirituality and theology and mysticism and all this stuff. And like I never made that connection. Like I never made the connection of people's like mystical or transcendent experiences with UFOs. But now, I mean, having had insight into the community, it almost feels like we're talking. I mean, obviously, we're always talking about kind of this like constellation of subjects when we talk about UFOs, but I'm I can't help but also think that a lot of people who are experiencers who are sort of like struggling to make sense of what they've experienced or don't have like a good narrative for like understanding it or framing it or even processing it, then see like because they have included UFOs as like a subject into their experience that's deeply personal, that any sort of skepticism becomes a negotiation about the truth of their experience, right? Even though the truth of their experience may exist in a kind of like rational third place beyond binary modalities of true and false, right? Like it may sort of exist in this sort of like psychosocial, mythological, whatever space. And I'm so, I guess this is why Campbell Moreira came out swinging with like, so what do you think of like the psychosocial stuff? What do you think of the myth? Because it feels to me like I'm so fascinated by how people know or connect these experiences with UFOs as a subject instead of just thinking of it as like transcendence or psychosis or whatever else, you know?
Well, that's an interesting point, and I think that that it really is self-selective. So the people in the UFO community are the people who have these experiences and process them in that through that lens. When I listen regularly to sort of like atheist call-in shows where an atheist talks with a believer. I've been doing that for like over 10 years. I find that very interesting, and people are calling in with very similar experiences to what I've seen in the UFO community regularly about these sort of like dissociative experiences, these moments of crisis when a figure comes to them, and we've all sort of seen these things, and then they process those things through their religious faith, and so it's like the alien or the UFO is almost like it really is the modern it's like the modern religion, isn't it? And
it's a Rorschach test.
Yes, yeah, it's a standard to see what your worldview is, really.
It reminds me, oh, Lewis, you're out of your K-hole. You're back to reality, man. It reminds me of like the miracle of Fatima, right? Like when you read like accounts of the appearance at Fatima that appeared before 50,000 people or something.
Yeah.
This is not literally the like cornflower blue and white veiled Mary. This is like a fucking ball of light in the sky that bounced around that a lot of people saw.
Well, they couldn't do it with the sun.
Yeah.
Campbell, this is actually, I think you're a good person to ask this question. You said you had no like interest, you had no dog in the race for UFOs growing up until about 2017 or 2018. But before that time, if someone asked you what a UFO is or to draw a UFO, what would you have said?
I would have drawn the spaceship on The Simpsons.
Right. A flying saucer.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So, I mean, like without being interested or being a part of the community, like kind of culturally, you knew that like weird things in the sky, especially at night glowing, are UFOs, and culturally UFOs are aliens. Right. So it's all, it's already there in us. Right.
Yes.
So, I mean, when people do have these kind of experiences, they're drawing on what they know, and anything coming down from the sky at night, any luminous objects in the sky going to be like, oh, that was a UFO. I saw this, which like, yeah, I mean, a lot of these experiences, like I believe that you did see that. I think you saw that, but that's just telling me your interpretation of it. Whatever happened could be a different story. I'll say it could be, but that's the lens, and that's kind of the lens you are given by, or at least our culture or our society now.
Well, you know, yes, absolutely. I think you're right. And before May and June 2021, if somebody told me they had seen a UFO, though, I probably would have said, I don't believe you, right? Like,
Sure.
Unless they, whatever, or I think they saw a plane or something. But if they described like, no, it was multicolored and there were lights all spinning, and then it like came down close to the ground and shone a light down, and then it blasted up instantaneously into space, I would be like, okay, well, it's far more likely that you hallucinated that. And it still is, even if objects that are capable of doing those things exist. Each individual, and that's what makes it so interesting. And that is what we've talked about before a little bit, is these natural phenomena that are one-off, random, very rare. And if you don't have sufficient equipment to capture it in a way that you can show others in a convincing way, anytime you observe something like that, it is far more likely that you did not observe it than you did observe it. And therefore, we end up in these circumstances where, like with ball lightning, until it's proven with a very high quality sensor system in 2014, we have maybe thousands or tens of thousands of people who observe these things. And then based on trying to like get an idea of what they saw, if you go to the skeptic community, you might be shut down.
Yeah.
And that's fair based on the scientific method, the absolute highest standards possible. If you don't have the spectrographic analysis published in peer review, all that stuff, like you can't say I saw a ball of light do this and that and this and have people believe you. And so then they turn and they go into, well, since I did see this, who's going to validate my experience? And the only narrative that is possible right now in a major sense is the non-human intelligence narrative, or if you want to say time traveling humans, I guess that
I think Nick West put it in an interesting way. It was like unconventional human intelligence or something like that, or
yeah, I mean, it's just getting so specific, it's losing all meaning to me at that point.
You have to appease everybody though, or otherwise he's
you reckon that rude. The Condine report, the author, he apparently was not allowed to talk to the people who'd made the reports.
Yes.
Which I guess is one of the disadvantages of super secret research, right? But I think he also was not allowed to talk to any scientists even.
It was too secret.
Yeah, and that's one of the critiques that David Clarke has made. But do you think in a way that's actually a blessing in disguise? Because as you were mentioning, Nick, earlier about like Michigan and the Hudson Valley report, people later come out with these like completely different or, very, the tale gets taller in the telling, right? So those original reports are sort of locked in time. So the witnesses can't, fuck it up anymore if you don't talk to them again.
Right.
When we talk too about having these kind of modern frameworks for interpreting events, right? Like talking about the role that like culture and media and religion has on these experiences, it just at a higher level, it reminds me, or it makes me think of just how malleable reality is in our perceptions, right? And how, we like to think that we have this objective sense of what's going on around us at any given time, both at a small and a large scale. But the reality is that we're really just, again, going down the Buddhist hole, we're just this sort of like empty network built up of nodes of different references and cultural and media touch points that we use to sort of frame and interpret what happens to us. Like our realities are so fucking constructed. Rather than being innate.
Oh, sorry. Wasn't the impetus of philosophical skepticism kind of based on the flaws of inductive reasoning? It was like,
Campbell, isn't it? This is your area of expertise.
This is kind of interpretation of it is that just kind of like the understanding that subjective, not like the distinction between a subjective reality based on how we experience it and how we draw conclusions based on the collection of our experiences can't be necessarily trusted as objective reality. And that was kind of like the beginning of skepticism, where like there are deductive truths like math and things like that. And then there's inductive based on our experiences. And I think I made a joke about this a long time ago in a space. Using solely inductive logic will tell you that the world is flat. We need like that outside information to kind of confirm, because walking down the street, yeah, it looks flat. I can't personally see the curvature of the earth. So inductively, I would kind of presume that the world is flat. I think that that's kind of the story of where skepticism comes from. I could be completely wrong about that, and that would kind of explain why no one knows what I'm talking about. But I think it was something along those lines.
Yeah, like in the mid 1700s, when the natural world was first getting more thoroughly investigated through understandings of, well, interestingly, electromagnetism.
Mm-hmm.
That's when people started coming together, and with the Royal Society, they established the Invisible College in 1760, roughly.
If we take our invisible SATs, we might one day get in.
Well, I'm not sure. Those will be tough, because the Royal Society is, I think, the longest standing natural philosophy association in the world. But yeah, no, that's it's interesting. Like originally, like the experiments around lightning, when you know, it was demonstrated that the little spark you can produce from static electricity appears to behave the same as lightning. Like that's like, okay, and then you can replicate that experiment and charge a crappy battery that you built the same way, regardless of whether you're in North America or in France. If you're in France, and that's the foundation of it. You have to be able to explain how somebody else can replicate what you're claiming to be true. Without that, exactly, like it falls apart, and then you get subjected to these sort of arguments like, oh, more people that see it, the more true it is. And
right.
We know that's not correct.
Is there any like super cool historical footage of UFOs that kind of, I'm not talking about the Nimitz or the other ones, the gimbal and the go fast, although maybe those are explainable by plasma type phenomena. But do you know of any other famous footage that sort of, you know, that you find personally intriguing and could be explained by plasma, ball lightning?
Yeah, it's hard to say. Valet has a paper, I believe, published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration as well. If I remember right, it's from like the mid 90s. It's called like Observations of the Luminosity of 5 UFOs or something like that. And he goes through like 5 highly luminous UFO cases, and he tries to assess the power that would be required to create the light source. And in that, I believe there are a couple that they claim to have videos. I haven't watched those videos, but the objects he describes have all the exact same features as what we've been talking about. So it would be a close match there. That said, I'm very resistant to getting into individual cases at this point, because when I started to talk about this stuff in 2021, I reached out to a bunch of people. I ended up you know, on the Singularity Lab with Michael Mataluni. Then I went on UCR, and then they had me on the big phone home to do. Michael gave me an hour, like, or you know, talked with me to plan an hour out to do the sort of plasma stuff, and then Daniel Miller and stuff. So it's like, you know, there's been this long history with me of trying to engage on the case study side of it. And I used the Nimitz as an example when I first got started. And there was so much pushback about every single individual element of it that I realized very quickly that it was like counterproductive to try to start like showing how certain cases might be able to fit into the information. I realized that this sort of deeper level, approaching it from the philosophical perspective after doing some research, like, I started doing research. I was like, why, when, and we haven't even gotten into all the other stuff, but why, when there is so much information that is so clear on this subject, can I not get people to actually just not listen to me because it has nothing to do with me, but read the information if they say they're so interested in this subject? And I couldn't wrap my head around it. And I just started reading about it. And then I realized through the published papers on the subject of like people processing information that it was based around like more about identity than about the actual information content. And so I decided to stop trying to do the sort of like step-by-step evidence of why a case could fit to the information. Instead, I just sort of my website is based on laying out the information with every single sentence cited to the source that I got it from. Like nothing on there is from me because I'm nobody. It's all about the information. And maybe like you brought up Condyne, and that's a really neat part of this. Just that after I first found those physics papers, my natural expectation instantly, I was like, Obama would know this. The American government would know that these things exist. So what the heck's this mean? What's going on with that? And that's when I turned to the National Archives.
I mean, but there's like whole other layers of conspiracies here that the president doesn't actually know very much about.
Well,
this
that
subject,
makes it,
right?
Well, and that gets into the interesting speculative territory that I'm happy to get into, but it does distract always from the real information. But that is what triggered my original interest. It's like, why would Obama be saying this? And then it's like the Americans should have the ability to positively identify basically anything if they want to. That's sort of what I pick up from their technological situation at this point. Why is he encouraging people to even look at it? And then it's like, well, there are all these physics papers showing that there seem to be objects with these features in the atmosphere and they seem to be natural. Why would Obama then encourage it that way? My interpretation after all of the information, including the American declassified records that we haven't even touched on, where they're saying over and over that the objects with these exact features are probably ball lightning. My assumption was that Obama recognized that information was being leaked, and I thought he was maybe trying to get ahead of the story by claiming ignorance. That was my interpretation of that after reading all this stuff. I don't know if that's true or not. That's just my personal understanding.
Or shape the narrative, right?
Yeah.
Like,
but I can't imagine him wanting people though to look at it, because based on the declassified documents, the last thing in the world that the intelligence services in the United States and the United Kingdom want are for people to actively think about UFOs. And that's why his comment was so confusing to me.
Yeah.
People love to think about and talk about UFOs.
I know, but they see it as a major threat.
They always want to talk about it.
Yes.
I think
that's the danger.
I think he was probably not aware of a lot of this stuff, but had read the New York Times paper and was just kind of playing off it. I know a lot of presidential appearances on late night shows, the topic of UFOs does come up. It happened with Clinton. I think it happened with Trump even. And they kind of give a, kind of a joking response and then
they were far more dismissive is the interesting part.
Sure.
And that was the odd
anyone
part
were
about
going to
Obama.
say something, I mean, one of these small mercies of Trump may be that if he'd actually known something, he would have fucking spewed it out on TV or Twitter. Like,
well, that's
he may be proof positive of the shadow government conspiracy, really.
And that's actually when I was speaking with Louise on your show. We talked about this a little bit. You asked me something to this effect, and once again, it's just my interpretation based on the documents I've read and stuff. But my interpretation is that the intelligence community in the United States appears to maybe have actually identified Trump as some degree of national security threat. And Obama said he was briefed on UFOs, right? He has said that. Now, Trump has also claimed he's been briefed. I suspect because his own national security advisor, or his director of national security, Ratcliffe, was out on the national news saying, "Oh, they're all we see these things on the radars or on the satellites, and they're zipping all over. We don't know what they're." It's like the director of national intelligence was a former Republican congressman, right? Ratcliffe, like he doesn't know what they are. Somebody's not briefing him. He's not briefing Trump. There's something very strange going on there. So my interpretation of that, not necessarily correct, but my interpretation is that they were left out of it distinctly.
I could see that.
But yeah, I guess we didn't.
Shadow government.
Yeah, and we didn't even get into any of the government documents, because once I read all those physics papers, I was like, the government must know about this, and that's when I turned to the well researched in the National Archives, all these documents going back, and
Right, they went back to like the Robertson panel, right?
Yeah, well, before that, like the FBI in 1949, it's a declassified file that was secret at the time, Protection of Vital Installations memo. They say there are descriptions of these lights. They have the variety of colors. They have these features that we said over and over again. And then they say, we don't know exactly what they are. They might be a new Soviet weapon, so we got to keep our eyes on it. We don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
Then the U.S. Air Force was created, and then they were assigned responsibility. And then they created Project Sign in, I think, 1950. And then they switched that into Project Grudge in, I think, 1951. And then, if I remember correctly, then they introduced Project Twinkle as a field study under Project Grudge. And they actually had military personnel for 9 months stake out one of the locations of military base that had a bunch of observations. And then that report came back and they said, they described the exact same features again. And then they have descriptions from major scientists and stuff. And I think actually it might have been at Los Alamos, because they cite the lead researcher, the nuclear researcher, Dr. Kaplan, and they have him in there. He's saying the green fireballs that keep being observed, we believe that these are natural phenomena. And and that's 1951. And then then you move into the CIA when they start looking at it.
Yep.
They start looking at it after the July 1952 Washington, D.C. events, which was a bunch of luminous objects were observed over Washington. They were on radar. The U.S. government scrambled fighters to go and engage the objects. Radar operators were looking at them through binoculars, looking on their screens, all this crap. Pilots were calling in, being like, we're in a formation of balls of light. What do I do? And they were not receiving responses because the commanders were like, okay, whatever, they're insane or something, right? So after
also,
that,
radio wouldn't work if they're close to something that has that much charge and stuff. Radio
that's
signals should be off the Kakta.
Well, you're right. That's actually an interesting thing from the Blue Book Minot Air Force Base report from 1968. That's much later, but I'll just summarize it very briefly. They say ball lightning they talk about the luminous balls of light. They're moving around, flying around, coming down, going up, all this stuff that we always talk about. They say ball lightning can be painted on radar. Ball lightning does interfere with electronic equipment.
Yep,
These were likely ball lightning. And they're it's just over and over.
What sort of physiological or psycho I don't know what the term would be. Basically, what does someone who witnesses or sees or is in close proximity to a ball lightning or plasma, what do they actually experience? Well, it should I don't just mean getting struck by lightning straight physicality, but even just shifts in consciousness, how people exposed to infrasound can sometimes experience things.
Yes. And that's something, we've touched on substantially. And this is very, it's hard to know for sure because there are no published papers on the subject of close proximity to ball lightning. Now, the most interesting document that I'm aware of on that exact subject would be the what's known as the Condign report. It is formerly called the UAP in the UK Air Defence Region Report. It was completed by the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defence, a very secret subsection called Defence Intelligence Section 55. They commissioned their top radar expert, which is an interesting little detail, in 1996. He spent 1996 to 2000 writing this report. His objective was to compile the last 20 to 30 years of military intelligence study of UFOs and to compile information and then to provide it to top executive leadership in defense intelligence to guide policy on the subject. So the purpose of the report was to be 100% accurate with the information. Obviously, humans are subject to error. The intent of the report was to be top secret and to guide policy on UFOs. That report in 2000 was published within the UK government. It was distributed to top leadership. We know that conclusively from reporting from The Guardian, Wired, BBC News. That report says that UAP Exist is indisputable. And then they say we aren't talking about generic, oh yeah, it's a seagull. They say the objects that are luminous, that hover, land, accelerate to exceptional velocities, and vanish. They can outmaneuver.
Oh, you're saying the thing.
I know. I'm saying it again. The second time. I've just proven that I can. And but the introductory paragraph says that they exist is indisputable, and then it defines them with the exact features that we're talking about. So it's not leaving any room for us to interpret it like, yeah, of course UFOs are whatever. They're saying no, they're UFOs. They are this exact type of thing, and they indisputably exist. That's not to say that it's
saying it. He's saying, because it was only one author, admittedly.
That's right. That's right. The UK, the report that was commissioned and distributed to top leadership in the UK says UFOs with the most radical features do indisputably exist, but it was written by a single author, and we can't verify that that's factually accurate. But we can verify factually is that top UK leadership, especially military intelligence leadership, has been briefed for the last 22 years that UFOs with the features that we're all talking about every day do exist. And that's pretty interesting, even if that was an incorrect report. And then the report says that they are almost certainly ball lightning. And the whole point of this was to get to the consciousness and the physiological effects. So this report, again, controversially, and Nick and I have talked about this, it cites a variety of studies that have not been conclusively verified to say that the effects of being in close proximity to these objects can cause hallucinatory experiences. It can cause scorching. It can cause radiation burns. That's what this report says that top leadership in the UK was briefed on. We don't know that that is true because there have not been proven cases in reality. But what we do know is that top military intelligence leadership in the UK has been told that this is true.
Right.
Somebody just asked, Chase asked if the ball lightning can cause radiation burns, and that just made me think of like some cases like the Cash Landrum case and the Colares case in Brazil, which maybe they did involve ball lightning, but we can't, as you mentioned, we can't verify that yet.
Yes. Yeah, and absolutely. Like, and it goes back and through history, there are like, you can cite over and over these instances. Like one that I've seen regularly is that like if you actually look at Blinded by the Light in the desert, St. Paul on the road to Damascus, he describes a light coming down, flying around, approaching him. He hears the voice, but he does not see. And then it's like, then the other version of the story says his servants saw the light, but did not hear the voice. And then he cannot eat, he can't drink, he has weakness for the next 3 days.
Interesting.
Gee, what does that sound like?
Sounds like radiation poisoning, exactly. But we can't say that that's true. We can't say
the
any
ultimate
of that
psychedelic.
Yeah. So there are these instances of a light comes at you, you experience things, and then you wake up later. It's interesting to note that lightning strike victims experience this kind of thing. If they get struck, they can become knocked out. They can wake up with amnesia. It's and those are in the peer-reviewed papers on that subject as well. So there's a lot of consistency between what you would expect potentially from a close encounter with a high radiation, ball lightning object, and then these subjective experiences. There's a lot of closeness in what you would expect, but we can't verify that in any way.
Sure.
Getting to the technical aspect of measuring this phenomenon or phenomena. So what do you think is like the best setup in terms of like equipment and location for trying to get like high quality spectral data, which is really, what's decisive here, and what sort of costs are involved in that?
It's a good question. I would look directly to the 2014 paper. And it's interesting, actually, because the ball lightning that was captured in that recording was, 4 feet across, 16 feet diameter approximately total with the luminous aura or whatever you want to call it. Now, but the actual, in terms of pixels, it's like, like 30 pixels across or something. It was like 2 kilometers from the sensor system. But the spectrograph was sufficient quality that they captured the resolution of the light coming off of it to such an extent that they could accurately describe exactly what chemicals and like what elements were involved in the source of that light. And so that was enough to enable positive verification. And it's funny to me that in the modern sort of conversation, we've got sort of, and you know, I like Mick West, but he says stuff like, I want triangulated 4K resolution of the UFO. Based on
Must
physics,
be nice.
well, and also if you had the 3 4K resolution cameras, that would not get published in physical review letters. It would be inadequate from an actual scientific perspective. You need the spectrographic evidence to prove the actual nature of what you're looking at. And so we have this obsession with a high resolution visual of the object. Based on what I've read, that is an inaccurate way of trying to prove this thing. If we want to even say ball lightning is entirely separate from what UFOs are, let's say they're completely discrete. The case study from ball lightning shows us step by step how you prove one of these slippery phenomena.
How much do these things cost? The high spectral. Could they become more ubiquitous?
I think they absolutely are becoming like that.
We gotta get super chats so we can buy one.
Okay. Yeah.
Like, share, subscribe, guys.
I know that like it was like 15 years ago or something in an interview I saw. I mean, I didn't see it 15 years ago. I saw an interview from like 15 years ago with one of the Hesdalen professors, the assistant professor Bjorn Haug. Actually, he's talking about how he doesn't have enough of a budget to buy a spectral camera capable of actually proving what he's seeing. I can't remember, like the price that he cites is like he needs $25,000 for it or something. And like I don't know if that's accurate or not, but they're quite pricey, certainly.
Yeah. But they're so pricey that not even Brandon Fugel can afford one.
And yeah, that's the real kicker. Yeah. It's like, it feels a lot like people who have a economic incentive to keep the mystery going.
It's funny how that works, right?
Yeah.
Why is nothing straightforward in this entire subject? Nothing. Always a million different motivations. None of which seem to optimize towards truth.
And once again, the government records allow us to not even speculate. We don't have to even imagine what the government's trying to achieve with their policy. We can actually read the declassified internal communications that they themselves are talking to each other about, what they're trying to accomplish on this subject. And it is entirely based on their fear of foreign adversaries. Russia, Soviet Union, what Jason Colavito's focused on so heavily, that the Russians are historically Soviets, use this as a way of creating social strife by like UFO research. And think about this. Think about UFO researchers trying to prove aliens. Think about the Freedom of Information Access system and creating an army of dedicated people who are exclusively motivated to get every single piece of information possible from the most secret things out there.
This reminds me of like one of the most aesthetically pleasing conspiracies I've heard is that string theory was developed as an op to distract physics research for the last 20 years. And like all this stuff, I mean,
from Weinstein himself.
Yeah, and Brian Greene. But like it's if you're just talking about the creation of a myth to create like institutional and bureaucratic friction and undermine trust in the government, like we've talked about that, right? And I think that that's why the alt-right, like this is why like Tucker Carlson does not give a fuck about UFOs.
Sure.
Tucker Carlson loves to undermine the government and institutions of record and unwind consensus reality.
Yeah.
And UFOs are a great vehicle for doing that, right? Like, of course, duh.
Yeah, and that was part of what got me interested originally, was that the idea of the objects being impervious to the American government's scrutiny defied my worldview because it was something stepping outside of expectation in that way,
right?
Like contradicting the established authority system.
What's the Canadian treatment of the subject? Justin
Very-
Trudeau ever touched an alien? Do we know?
What we do have, actually, there's an excellent journalist based out of, I think he's in North Bay now. I think he was originally from Toronto, Daniel Otis. He's been on UCR several times. He worked for Vice. I'm not sure if he still works for Vice, but he has done a huge amount of work on this. We know that the Canadian Defense Minister was briefed on it a couple of years ago. There was just sort of like, no, there's nothing going on here. What we do know historically is there's a man named Chris Rutkowski. He is a academic. He's out of, I think, University of Regina or something. But anyway, he ended up in the, if I remember correctly, the story, it's such a classic kind of like Canadian small town type thing almost. Like he was like he was doing research with, I think, the National Archives or something in the 90s. He ended up talking to somebody involved with like receiving the radar return, or the reports created by the Aviation Authority when a UFO is observed. And then this person he was talking to was saying, like, we don't know what to do with these things. He's interested in UFOs, and he just straight up said to the guy, like, I'll take them, I'll archive them. And since the 90s, the official Canadian government reporting agency just forwards all of the cases to this random guy. And he talks about it often on shows and stuff. Seems like a nice guy, but that's the level.
Campbell, one more question for you. What's it like living in a country that doesn't have brain worms?
Oh,
what's a brain?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Is that like this new thing
like
I saw?
The fact that like you, like Canada can institutionally approach this subject in a reasoned and not insane way.
Honestly, I'm regularly very thankful for living where I live.
It must be nice.
Yeah. The biggest single thing is healthcare, universal healthcare. That's just it. It gives me absolute freedom in a way that I can't understand why y'all down in America loving freedom don't want freedom to quit your job and not have to worry about bankrupting your family.
Oh, I know. This is my impetus to go back to work. I'm paying like $1,200 a month for healthcare right now, and it's not even complete. I still have to pay if I go to a doctor. It doesn't cover everything.
There's like a copay.
It's absolutely insane. Yeah,
it's a nightmare. Yeah. So, but yes, it's nice to work in a country where things at least minimal.
Functional infrastructure is communism, so I don't have that here.
Which country do you think has got the most reasonable approach to UFOs, UAP?
That's a really interesting question.
Government engagement. I mean, at the government level. Because I know that like France and Brazil and what's another country? Some countries in other countries in South America.
What's another country? Africa. Asia.
Yeah, some of them. Some take it seriously. Yeah, and it's like an interesting question. Like, okay, I have a suspicion. I can't prove it, obviously. I have a suspicion that the Chinese government might actually know what's going on, in part because the 2014 paper was published and it was done by researchers in China studying lightning and electromagnetism. Cool. And their advances on the subject of electromagnetism are pretty terrifying at this point. They are leaning into it in a way that we
tons of money
don't.
Into research institutions.
Yeah, and even in 2000, in this UK secret report, they say that they think they're most afraid that the Russians are ahead of them on the subject of plasma research, in part potentially due to the stigma around UFOs. It's an interesting irony there, potentially, that they end up being behind on science because of trying to suppress the observations of the objects because they're afraid of the defense significance. It's like, pretty interesting. I don't know.
Yeah. Strange.
UFOs touch everything, man. They're like that one subject that cross discipline with like every other thing, it seems like.
Yeah. And maybe everything I'm saying today in like 10 years, it's like, oh, he was 100% off. Like everything that guy said is just totally nuts. I have, whatever. I'm just like any other person who like does research and then thinks that they know what they're talking about. I've tried to do the most I can to have it have nothing to do with me and only be direct cited to original sources. And I'll just say that the disparate sources of the descriptions of the objects being described all resolving as like fundamentally observationally apparently the same thing to me is very compelling. You have the FBI report from 49, the CIA reports from 52, and ongoing. You have the U.S. Air Force Blue Book reports describing the same objects, the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense describing the same objects. You have J. Allen Hynek, Jacques Vallée. You have the history of ghosts. You have the history of elves and the luminous beings, the fairies, all this stuff. And then you look at it all, and then you have proof that luminous objects that are very large do exist in the atmosphere, and they have the same features, and seems compelling to me, but maybe I'm just crazy.
Yeah. I mean, look, like the entire point of our conversations, right, are to elevate the discourse and to show what it means to negotiate and navigate a subject like this.
Yeah, and I'm willing to be proven wrong, and that's so important.
Yeah,
you know,
that's
I think it's,
not having a teleology is so important, right? Like commitments to truth, not to consistency. Always being willing to give up ideas and opinions upon presentation of more compelling or verifiable evidence.
You know, what I kind of personally think is compelling about where you're coming from, Campbell, is that these characteristics describe some of the more, at least in my opinion, some of the more stronger UFO cases. Like my top case is Lake Michigan, and it describes that very well. But the 1952 invasion, Mino Air Force Base, you mentioned also radar visual sightings, which, you know, that's more than you can say that about a lot of UFO cases, is these better witnessed ones, to borrow that phrase again, that have visual and radar data along with it, do all kind of fall into the descriptions of what you were talking about also. So I think that it's compelling enough to like use that as a lens to go back through other old cases and stuff like and to see how far it matches up with a lot of the other descriptions. I mean, like nocturnal lights is a classic UFO description. I wonder how many more classic cases you go back and be like, you know, these do fit the descriptions, because for a lot of those which are classified as unknowns, I mean, that's at least a very plausible explanation for some of these ones that haven't had an explanation, like the Lake Michigan case that I've been looking into. I mean, this is the only thing that actually kind of fits, so I'm putting that at the top of my list as to identifying these things.
That's cool. And okay, and that is sort of the essence of what I sort of picked up on when I started looking into this more and more, without any of this history of the cases. When I started looking at some of the cases and getting into the details of the way people reported it, the number of people, it is hard to not think like, it's like these people, I feel like at least some of them are seeing something somewhat like what the sort of like vague set of descriptions ends up coalescing into.
Sure.
And it's like, it is compelling just from a human perspective to like trust, right? And so seeing all of these things, like the U.S. Air Force record, like declassified, you know, Blue Book report from 1968 saying ball lightning has these features. This is probably a ball lightning. And then thinking of like, there has been that possible space in this subject where some people actually are seeing these things that if I had been told that they saw them until last year, even, I would have said, no, yeah, that I don't think that doesn't exist. That's not within my sphere of reality to have these huge luminous things flying around like that.
Right.
And so it's like, there is an injustice there in people's, if this is correct, that the objects have been observed by these people in this way for so long, like there is an interesting touch of injustice there in the invalidation that's occurred. And look at the UK Ministry of Defense report from 2000 saying we're going to keep this secret because we need to study these things in more depth and get on top of exactly how they function, since they could have potential applications in all kinds of things like fusion power and radar spoofing and all this crap. It's like they're on paper, it says we're intentionally keeping this thing secret. So it's like, it is the conspiracy, but it's written down by the government. And it's like, it makes it so much more interesting. I think this subject will become increasingly fascinating as sort of things become more and more known over time.
Agreed.
Wonderful. Gentlemen, we are just about at the top of the hour.
Wow. Yeah.
It was good to get the gang back together. It's been a while.
Indeed.
Before we wrap things up, Nick, what do you have going on?
I'm still doing kind of the big report on Lake Michigan, and with the release of the Netflix series or Unsolved Mysteries, I have more to add to it now. So I want to check that water spout thing off the box in there too. So it's coming along. It'll probably be done in like a week or two, but that'll be kind of comprehensive of what I've learned and gone over throughout the whole case, and kind of like all of the information in one place and citing all the sources, kind of like what I did with Hudson Valley.
Nice. Lewis, what about you?
I'm actually related to the plasma stuff. I'm actually reading this book.
Oh, nice.
Cool. Great cover, by the way. I love these, they look like Trapper Keeper covers.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like there's some good stuff in here, and some not so good stuff. It's one of those types of books, but we'll see.
Sure.
I'll give you a report on it when I finish.
Wonderful.
Expect that.
Campbell.
Nice. Yes.
You were the man of the hour, but what else is cooking?
Well, I've been just doing a bit of work on my website. I actually added a couple new pages, a page dedicated to like the Invisible Night School, just to
Nice.
connect that, and then a page of acknowledgments for people who have helped me out on the website. And I'm working on another page, just compiling like the videos where I've been in like interviews and stuff, based on Louise, your suggestion. Actually, I think throw those videos on there. So that's what I've been working on.
Cool.
Awesome. Great.
You?
Yeah. What about you?
I'm just trying to keep the trains running on time. Now, so we're going to be trying out this new time slot, Wednesday evenings, 9 p.m. Eastern. I think, look, we always discuss epistemology and ontology on this show. Whether or not COVID is actually over is certainly up for debate, but it seems that people's weekends are quickly becoming filled with social activities instead of staring at screens. So Wednesday evenings, I think, is what we're going to be shooting for. Nick, we'll have you on next week, talk through 1994 Lake Michigan in depth with your slides.
Yeah.
I'd love to do a show on experiencer phenomena, right? And how it maps to like different experiences of exotic and altered states of consciousness, near-death experiences, psychedelics, etc. Basically, my favorite subjects. Thanks everyone for joining us. You can find us at theinvisiblenightschool.com. I'm Leah Prime, and I am joined by Nick Callis. Callis.
Mm-mm.
Callis. Callis. I'm going to do it every time. Every freaking time.
Either way.
Luis Caetano, who's ufologyiscorrupt.com, and Campbell, UAP Study, owns and runs UAPstudy.com.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I always forget if it's .com or .net.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks again for the lovely conversation, gentlemen, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
Cool. See you next week.
Thanks.
See ya.